We've got quite a lot of people coming to the room. Lovely to see you this evening. We'll make a swift start if that's okay. I'm Emma Hoddinott. I'm one of the Assistant General Secretaries here at the Co-op Party, and hopefully you are here for our Cooperation Live this evening on the Economic Crime Bill and the Register of Overseas Entities. Before we make a start, I've got a few sort of housekeeping things to run through for the event tonight. The first thing is this event is being closed captioned. So if you need to use the closed captions, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there is a CC button. If you press that, then you'll be able to see the transcript come up as we speak tonight. So that is available from our captioner this evening. The second one is this event is being recorded. And it will be available afterwards. If you don't want to appear on that recording, then please turn your video off. We may do a photo as well. So if you don't want to appear on that, then please turn your video off, and so you can't be seen as part of that. We will have you on mute. It is lovely to see you, but we have quite a few people in the room. So we will keep you muted so we can hear from our fantastic speakers. And this evening we have two great speakers, and then there may be an opportunity for some questions and answers later. So I will make a start. It's been quite a busy day in Parliament, as I think a lot of us have seen today. We're seeing the worst cost of living crisis ever. And I think more than ever, it questions how the economy works and whether it works for us and the fairness of the rules of the economy as well. And we know at the Co-op Party, for too long, offshore companies have been able to buy up property in the UK, hollowing out communities and masking potential corruption. And I think the recent events in the Ukraine and the issues of sort of Russian ownership have really brought this issue to the fore. The Economic Crime Bill has been an important step, but this evening we want to talk about really about how we take that further. We're calling for the government to close the loophole in remaining legislation, because at the moment overseas owners have up to 6 months to comply, and these oligarchs and criminals are having the time to hide away their assets. We've got two fantastic speakers who have been doing amazing work on this issue already this evening. The first one is Seema Malhotra. She's one of our lovely Labour and Co-op MPs, but she's also the Shadow Minister for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And then we also have Paul Monaghan, who is the Chief Executive of the Fair Tax Mark. And I'll let Paul tell you about the Fair Tax Mark and the work he's been doing with that. But without further ado, I will hand over to Seema. Lovely to see you this evening.
Great, thank you very much, Emma. Look, it's always absolutely wonderful to join a co-op meeting and to see so many cooperators here. Pleasure to join with Paul today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say as well, and as many comments as I can also take before I'll have to leave by about 6:45 or just before. Great to see John Grigg here as well, who helped me when my first ever campaigning when I was still a teenager. So that's wonderful. Look, I just thought it would be helpful to start to just give an overview of what we did in Parliament and what Johnny Reynolds and myself and some others, so real cooperators, Stella Cluse as well, really focused in on, and some of the concessions that we did win from the government. And it is important that we talk about this as well today after the spring statement, which frankly, you'll know was a completely missed opportunity to tackle the challenges that we're facing. And it is just this government over and over again that they need to be dragged kicking and screaming to do anything, and will in the end try and they will make decisions in their own interests and their party interests. And so it is notable that they utterly drag their feet on stopping dirty money flowing through our economy. The measures in this bill were first promised over 6 years ago. And even now, as Emma started to outline, the government don't plan to implement the new measures anywhere near quickly enough. You'll know that the bill finally establishes a public register of beneficial owners of non-UK entities that buy or own land or property in the UK. It will be operated by the Companies House registrar, and beneficial owners are those who ultimately own or control an asset. The major issue has been that far too many hide their identity behind a foreign company. And there is the requirement to register that's been set out in the bill has thresholds, which possibly we'll also come back to, around ownership, voting rights, and significant control and influence. So it isn't all beneficial owners that need to register. It's those that have certain thresholds, i.e. 25% ownership, voting rights, etc. But look, we raised a number of concerns, and we did have some significant concessions as the bill went through its 1 week of passage in Parliament. Some were accepted, some are not yet accepted. Now, as one example, as the bill stands, a foreign entity only needs to update their entry on the register during an annual statement. We were really concerned that gives the opportunity to register an entry in a non-controversial individual's name, change the beneficial owner the next day, and then it's 12 months before you have to declare that, by which point you can have that property or asset sold and money laundered with potentially limited record of that. Now, the integrity and the quality of the data on the register is going to really matter. And it's absolutely vital that setting this register up isn't a tick box exercise. It absolutely needs to have a framework of very strong rules from the outset to ensure the timeliness, the completeness, and the accuracy of information. And also, very importantly, effective penalties and enforcement for non-compliance. Now, those are a couple of issues I also want to come on to, because one of the things that one of the amendments we tabled was to, alongside this annual statement of the register and any changes, is to have a trigger event. So if you did change the beneficial owner within the year, then you had to do an update within 14 days of that trigger event. So far, the government have refused to move on that, but I do hope that there'll be some look at that again, because look, the UK companies have clear obligations to notify Companies House in the days or weeks after a change in ownership or control. So why do overseas entities have a year to effectively do the same? Now, coming on to enforcement, we had a very interesting moment in the bill, because originally the bill had a daily fine of £500 that was proposed that would be made against entities that failed to update the register. Now, the idea that a £500 fine would in any way deter billionaires was frankly laughable. And we put down an amendment, just at least pushing this to say it should be at least 2,500. And what did the government do? It was really interesting how they started to operate in Parliament. They don't accept our amendments. What they do is table effectively the same amendment in their own name. And that's what they did with this. So when we had the debate in the Commons, the government had effectively tabled their own amendment that increased the fine to 2,500 a day. And it just makes you wonder, what on earth ministers were doing when they were drafting the bill in the first place, if that was so clearly obvious a change and one they accepted. But we also were very concerned, and to some extent, this will also continue to run, about how you're verifying the registrable beneficial owners, because too much of this is about taking their word for it. And when you're dealing with people that have an interest in hiding things, you have to have ways in which you're verifying the data that you're getting. So another place in which the government made a concession was accepting Labour's argument that the process for verification also needed to be put in place before the register was operational. And the government tabled their own amendment replacing ours that we supported. We are pushing for when secondary legislation will be published on this verification process, and also making sure that verification actually takes place before an overseas entity is given an overseas entity ID. I mean, as soon as you get an ID, it sort of legitimizes you. And if you haven't gone through a process of verification, then there's a sort of, there was quite a serious loophole through which you could see that some of, that you wouldn't have that data publicly available. And so we did get some concessions about verifying the registrable beneficial owners and when that would need to happen. Now then, on the shortened transition period, I think this was in the news quite a lot, that the government was initially looking at 18 months for a transitional period in which you could have the entries on the register. That did get reduced to 6 months. Now, we called for this to be 28 days. And in our view, this was reasonable because this was first promised by David Cameron in 2016. So frankly, it's been more than 28 days. It's been 6 years and 28 days. And I think, we're still looking at where there are kind of loopholes in some of these delays. It still, in our view, provides ample time for those involved in money laundering to sell properties and find other assets in which they might invest. And while there were some concessions over sort of what you can do after sort of, from day zero, it isn't, it still hasn't got rid of this 6 months. And in our view, this is still an area that we're concerned about. And then, there's a couple of other points I think it's just worth mentioning. It wasn't acceptable to us that the bill only applied to properties bought after 1999 in England and Wales and after 2014 in Scotland, because it doesn't matter when oligarchs bought their property. What we need to know is who owns what in Britain. And if the reason, as the government has said, is that some of those records are less available, in our view, that did lend itself to saying, well, look, if it needs to be a longer transition period for some of those records that are harder to establish, and maybe not on the latest date in the later databases, then we did concede that the 18-month transition period may be appropriate for or may be acceptable as a compromise for those properties that the government was saying were harder to include. I mean, we haven't had there's a kind of, it was more of a sort of alluding to that rather than a kind of firm view. But it is important that we make sure that all of Britain is covered. And I'll just finally say that one area that we were really concerned about was the lack of reform of Companies House. The government published a white paper on this on the day that the bill was published, which in our view, frankly, just isn't good enough. And it is a key area where we need to see the next round of legislation come forward. And one of the things that's going to make a success of the register of overseas entities is going to be this reform of Companies House from being a register to being a regulator. And that's going to require more powers, and it's going to require greater kind of responsibility and accountability for what is done. So, I mean, there'll be other areas I'm sure that we'll want to discuss today, but probably I'll leave my opening remarks there and just say that we're expecting, and we hope for the ECB2, I think it's, as it's begun to be referred, to come back, fairly soon in the new session. The government has promised that there will be more time to debate it. So we may expect to see a longer period of passage through the House. But what my honest view is that we know a range of the areas that need to be brought forward. It is absolutely right that we start the campaign for that now, because when the bill comes forward, and we expect it to be announced in the Queen's speech and then introduced to the House, we would have thought to be one of the earlier bills. Then we want to be ready with what we want, the bill to deliver. They're talking about 150 pages. So, what we don't want is just to be blinded by science. We want to be ahead with an agenda and with what we expect that the bill would need to deliver in order to deal with dirty money in the UK, and stop London being the centre of where that money circulates and goes out through our economy. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Seema, and thank you for all the work that you did do on the first bill in terms of getting those concessions and for highlighting, I guess, the shortcomings. Some really important issues still outstanding, particularly around that transparency of ownership. I think it's been a real issue that's highlighted, particularly over the last few weeks, about who owns what and the need for that to be transparent and clear, and obviously is still a long way to go, and interested in your thoughts really about how we take that campaign forward in anticipation of another bill to address that. Without further ado, I will hand over to Paul Monaghan, who is the Chief Executive of the Fair Tax Mark. So nice to see you in sunny Manchester, Paul.
Yeah, it actually is sunny for once. Whoa. So you might be thinking, fair tax, what have we got to do with anti-corruption? The truth is, the fair tax mark, and when we've looked at companies in the past, we've always assessed quietly, it's never been appreciated, issues such as beneficial ownership disclosure. So as Seema said, for example, currently the UK requires, whether it's property or a company, you disclose if you've got more than 25%. Well, we require disclosure at 5%, much lower threshold, as do a number of other countries. We look at things like related party transactions. So it's also like, you've got one company here, one company there, everyone's looking at this company, you slide it sideways, etc. So we've quietly looked at this for quite some time, and we've been lobbying on it again quietly. But an unprecedented alliance has built in the UK, I think, since the terrible invasion of Ukraine. So previously, all the tax justice groups were over here, and all the anti-corruption groups were over here. We have now come together as never before. And I think we've all been working in concert, and there was a wonderful set of conversations going on between these groups and Seema and Jonathan Reynolds, etc., in both the Commons and the House of Lords, where we were backward and forward saying, can we get this built in, can we get that? And they were pushing the envelope, and long may that continue. But we need to look at that economic crime bill that was passed in just 2 weeks. It's unprecedented, 2 weeks from the legislation being tabled on the 28th of February till the Act gaining royal assent on the 15th of March. That's just the beginning. In fact, that economic crime bill is really more or less just an overseas property register. And it's important. We're talking about 90,000 properties. We're talking about 30,000 individuals. But as Seema related, Companies House has got 4.4 million companies sitting on it. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. The mafia are setting up companies literally in the UK. They're naming the beneficial owners as Alibaba, and they're putting the address as the Den of the 40 Thieves. They're not just undertaking systematic fraud. They're laughing at us whilst they do it, because Companies House has no powers to investigate. It doesn't even have the power to pass its concerns over to HMRC if they think they see tax fraud. The whole thing is an absolute joke. So we've got an opportunity coming up in early summer to make the UK not a joke for company registration, but hopefully a leader, a world leader on what is actually possible. Because the numbers we're talking are incredible. We're talking about hundreds of billions of money laundering going through the UK every year. The National Crime Agency's estimated that the cost to the UK is at least 100 billion a year in terms of fraud. Never mind the cost to all the other countries in the world who suffer from us enabling this. Some of the fraud is done in the UK, and in some instances, the money doesn't even touch the sides because it goes out to the British Virgin Islands or the Caymans. But we are the centre of that hub. So make no mistake, some people believe, it's arguable, that the UK is the money laundering centre of the world. Not just one of them, which is without doubt, it could even be the. This is a source of national embarrassment. And the truth is, it's been in place for a number of generations. But I think what we're seeing is the terrible, terrible situation that we've got in Ukraine has made people wake up at last. We've stopped looking at these kleptocrats and these oligarchs as people were looking at them as almost a source of fun. There was reality TV shows about, look at all the wealth of the sons and daughters of the kleptocrats in London. Look at them spending it. Isn't it funny? It's not funny, it's evil. We have finally woken up. As Seema said, a property register that was promised 6-7 years ago has now happened in 2 weeks. We need to change the whole thing. It touches tax justice, it touches fraud, it touches terrorism, it touches money laundering. The whole thing is there to be won, because in my experience of working in and around corporate responsibility in the last, let's say, 30 years, I have never seen as an unprecedented set of Western sanctions, government to government, has been what's applied to Russia. And I have never seen companies withdraw from a country like we're seeing. Not even anti-apartheid in South Africa. Was there anything of this scale and speed and breadth? We've got a moment here. If we snatch it, we could broaden it into all the oppression that's out there. So there's a group of us going to try and do that. We're talking, and we want to keep talking to Labour and the Co-op Party. I had a wonderful meeting with Joe Fortune and the team earlier today to say, how do we make sure we are ready for early summer, as and when that legislation happens, Economic Crime Bill 2, there may even be an Economic Crime Bill 3. How do we make sure we hit the ground running? How do we get away? So one start point would be, in the UK, it costs £12 to set up a company. And Companies House promises it'll be set up within 24 hours. Who needs to set up a company in 24 hours costing 12 quid? Many, many dodgy people from around the world do it. Even now, companies are being set up by Russian individuals sitting in Russia, in the UK, and they are set up now, as in the last few days. It's ridiculous. There was a piece in the paper the other day, there's a flattening in Tower Hamlets. 200 companies have been set up, registered to a poor woman's flat. She's got nothing to do with it, and all the paperwork's coming through. Set up by an individual in China, registered in China. Our country is a joke on this. We believe that, and the Treasury Select Committee agrees this, the cost of setting up a company should be at least £100. If you've not got £100, you shouldn't be setting up a company. Let's be straight. If you go to other countries, they only don't set up a much higher fee. They actually require companies' information to be in there at the beginning. And this 24 hours to set up a company is a recipe for disaster. How can you do checks in 24 hours when you've got 4.5 million on the register? 800,000 companies set up in the UK every year. It can't be done. So we need to get serious, stop becoming the laughing stock of the world, and actually become a real beacon of integrity, because London is supposed to be one of the major financial centres in the world. Let's make sure it can do that with pride, I would say.
Thank you very much for that rallying call, Paul, and some really important points there. We're going to open up to any sort of questions or comments. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your virtual hand. It's under the reactions button, or you can ask a question in the chat as well with regards to that. I think there's a few questions coming in, but I just want to ask Seema and Paul actually a very quick one. You've raised a lot of points and lots of issues that need to be raised. What would your number one priority, though, be for the next economic crime bill in the summer? What would be top of your to-do list? Seema?
There's a bit of a battle at the top of the to-do list, but I do think that the Companies House reform is going to be really, really important. And that's for the reasons that Paul's highlighted, but also for the effectiveness of any regime and enforceability. It's got to be really, really, really thought through and brought forward as quickly as possible.
I completely agree with Seema. The number one priority is Companies House reform. I've already mentioned that the ridiculous cost of setting it up and the speed of setting up a company. If I had a number two, it would be all companies, regardless of size in the UK, should produce a full set of financial statements, a profit and loss and a balance sheet. Right now, companies up to about 20 million turnover can just produce what's called an abridged balance sheet. It's useless. It is a source of hiding income and profit, etc. We saw it with many of those PPA contracts and the dodgy companies that were getting set up, and we couldn't get to the numbers. As it stands right now, we've been lobbying for this for 2 years. The white paper actually says businesses of all sizes should produce a full profit and loss and a full balance sheet. I expect there to be a big backlash against that, and I hope we can keep it in there.
It's all gone very quiet.
Can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I think the host is muted.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought I've unmuted Geoff and not myself. So if you want to go ahead, Geoff.
Thank you very much. It's Geoff Eales here. My last post before retirement was with the National Crime Agency, working on economic issues. Agree with everything that's been said this evening on Companies House being an enabler and the need for regulation rather than just a register. There's the big elephant in the room, though, is following even effective regulation. If there's no enforcement, effective enforcement, victims of economic crime are the largest of all groups of crime victims, yet they receive only 1% of police spend. So I think in addition to this sort of much needed work, looking at the key enablers and attacking a whole range, as Paul said, of criminal activity, from terrorism to criminal money laundering, we need to take really a root and branch review of everything involved in economic crime to provide the public with the protection that they're simply not getting at the moment. And the amount, I think, Paul, is actually larger. I think the NCA figure for fraud is 190 billion a year, and that's before we had the bounce back loan frauds, which were enabled by exactly the Companies House inadequacies that we're talking about now, and that were seriously exploited. So that's my view. If it helps anyone, I've brought together a sort of mini working group, and should have had a meeting actually with Tulip on Monday evening to see whether myself from the NCA, a former head of economic crime at the City of London Police, and also a former director level from MI5 can bring our collective expertise together to help the shadow teams look at these issues. So with that, I'll shut up.
No, and thank you very much for that offer, Geoff. I'll take David and Pervez before coming back to Seema and Paul, but if there are any females who want to ask a question, you'd be more than welcome. Please do contribute. David Pickersgill.
Can you hear, please?
Yes, we can hear you, David.
Thank you. I used to work in the Inland Revenue, not very high grade. And the one thing I discovered was more tax law meant more tax avoidance. And every time they pass a new law, there's a complete industry of tax avoidance. And you could get a lot more tax in if you cut tax laws. Every government's gone the wrong way about it. They've passed more laws, and more laws enables people to put laws together. It's like the Black Panthers in America. They used the law of the right to observe a police officer in the course of his duty and the right to carry a firearm. So they were following the police with pump action shotguns in America. And like that was their protest in Britain. More tax laws get passed, more tax avoidance.
Thank you, David.
And second on the same issue, there's one issue that's an absolute disgrace. It's image rights. That a lot of people who are famous, who write their memoirs or play football, claim their salaries on image rights. So because they claim them on image rights, they only pay basic rate tax. Like most, even the politicians only pay 20 pence in the pound on the books they're writing things, because it's because of their image, if you know what I mean. That's a disgrace. Anyway, sorry about that, but that's me twotance. Good
Thanks,
night.
David. An interesting perspective about whether more rules make it easier. Pervez Qureshi, do you want to come in? And if I've said your name wrong, my apologies, do correct me.
No, you're absolutely right. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go on.
Yes. I think it was really timely and very useful that you have taken this program. But my concern is about the small companies. I run small companies, and I know the bureaucracy can make life difficult for many thousands of small companies. So I think maybe it's going to be a better approach if we can distinguish, small companies, those who are community-based, and the big, overseas companies, those who trade properties and big assets. Otherwise, small companies will suffer with all the bureaucracy and red tape. At the same time, the gentleman touched on bounce back loan. It's a shame because we saw thousands of people, taking out money without any accountability, and they just fled the country. Because I know a lot of builders, they had limited companies. They just applied, they received the money, and they just drove with the money. So, this is our tax. We are paying the tax, but we are not seeing the benefit. But again, I think the proposal has to be in a way that small, community-based companies like Co-op and, little boys on the high street, they don't suffer with big bureaucracy. But big boys, they need to be taken care of. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you very much. And before I hand over to Seema and Paul, there's a couple of little questions in the chat as well about whether the bill will address the issue of multinational companies registered with Company House that operate overseas to avoid paying taxes. And then and a really interesting question actually about the new overseas property register, whether that's a step closer to a fully transparent land registry where we can actually see ownership information. So quite a few comments there, Seema, if you want to pick up a few of those, some interesting contributions.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Look, that's really helpful. Look, just a few points. I do want to pick up on the point about enforcement, and thank you, Geoff, for that. The Prime Minister had announced the creation of a new combating kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency. But I think just alluding to some of the points that Geoff made as well, that we've seen money laundering prosecutions have actually dropped by 35% over the last 5 years. And also the NCA's budget dropping over 4% in real terms in the last 6 years, and the Crown Prosecution Service seeing a cut of a third since 2010. So we're sort of on the back foot when it comes to enforcement capability, skills, experience, and information. So absolutely, I think that has to be a significant focus as well. In terms of, I can't seem to see some of the questions in the chat, but I think, I mean, look, we want the registers to be as complete and robust as possible, and this clearly has been lacking in terms of the overseas ownership of land and property in the UK. So I think this is an area where exactly what transpires and making sure that is fully transparent is going to be really really important. And look, I do think that the point about ownership information being available without a fee, I mean, I'm supportive of that. I'd like to see that be possible because transparency is transparency. But there are some details of things that we haven't yet had front bench discussions on. I think that will also be part of what's ongoing. And just a sort of final point on Pervez's comment. Look, we don't want any disproportionate bureaucracy. I think that's fair. You don't want to sort of have unintended consequences where you make life harder for, almost 6 million small companies in the UK while you're trying to solve another problem. And look, this is part of why some of the issues I've raised in the comments has been how do we make reforms to Companies House and the registers they might hold. So there's this one, there's going to be the subsidy control database. They're also going to be overseeing to some, or BEIS is overseeing. But when you do things, you've got to design ways in which they are easy to update and clear what's on there, rather than sort of being blinded by science. So you could search easily, and it's designed with with use in mind, not with trying to hide what's in there. So the government has a job to do to make sure that what is set up is not onerous, because all that will do is confuse and obfuscate, and part of reform has also got to be effective systems that are going to be easy to use and easy to access.
Thank you very much, Seema. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for taking the time out this evening as well. I know you've got to dash off. It's a busy day in Parliament, but thank you very much, and thank you for spending the time with us this evening. So I will pass on to Paul. I think Seema addressed quite a few of those issues, but please feel free to pick up from your perspective as well. And if there are any sort of final questions when Paul finishes, I will do a last minute sort of catch up on the chat or hands before we conclude. So over to you, Paul.
Yeah, so just reiterate again, picking up Geoff's great point, which is resources. It's been widely observed that the US doesn't have as good legislation as us in many areas, but they have fantastic enforcement. In fact, many of the criminal wrongdoings in the UK that happen are actually picked up by the US enforcement agencies, who table bigger fines than we do, and we follow in the slipstream. Again, another source of embarrassment. One of the big asks of all these groups getting together is proper funding of a range of agencies. The reason I said raise the fee at Companies House from £12 to £100 is that would raise about, back of the fag packet I worked out, about 50 million a year, which could be used to do the checks at Companies House that's required. I would also say the reason the UK is a centre for dodgy company formation is because the fees are so low and the speed's so quick. And I need to also say, and it's not popular, I believe there's more tax evasion and tax avoidance, more fraud, more terrorism funding, more drug funding going through small companies than any big companies. Because what organised crime does, what the tax dodgers do, is they fragment a big company into lots of little companies. And each of the little companies is beneath the threshold of a check. And you add it all together, we're looking at hundreds and hundreds of millions off one scam after another. So it may not be popular and it may be slightly painful, but I question, why is it easier to set up a company in the UK than to get a book out the library? There are more checks on getting a book out of the library than there are setting a company up in the UK. Now, if that's the type of country we want to be, well, we can be that type of country, but don't expect us to be the hub for tax evasion and fraud that we are. Which brings us to the role of enablers. I think we need to start criminalising enablers, accountants, lawyers, etc., who are setting these things up. As has been pointed out, oligarchs don't set up the dodginess. They employ a lawyer or an accountant to do it for them. Let's go after them. Let's see some accountants and lawyers doing some jail time. Then we will see a serious progress in this area. And then lastly, I do think there was an interesting point about the image rights, but I would just point out, because there are some good people out there, there was a big data link to do with football recently. Kante, who plays for Chelsea, actually in the emails it was disclosed, he told the club, don't you put my image rights offshore, I want to pay my taxes. So as with many of these areas, it's important we don't think everybody's a bad guy and everybody's at it. So many good people, so many good corporations, but they lose out when we have a weak playing field because they cannot compete. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So any sort of final questions, feel free to raise your hands. If not, there's just an interesting, Geoff, you've put a comment in about financial recovery. So I'll let you have 1 second go at sharing your expertise and asking a question, and then I'll ask Paul to wrap up. Oh, you're on mute, Geoff. It's you this time.
Apologies. Under current arrangements, we collect about 5 billion, or we have collected about 5 billion in criminal recoveries over the last 5 years. So my suggestion is, why don't we think seriously about recycling those recovered criminal proceeds into that comprehensive approach to enforcing against economic crime.
Paul, do you want to come back on that, and then sort of any final comments you have?
Yeah, just very quickly, my understanding of looking at the numbers, whether it's HMRC or whether it's Companies House or it's the NCA, every pound you invest in these enforcement agencies, you get between £3 and £7 back. There's a big shortfall in the budget. It's also better for business. It's better for our integrity. So I believe, as bad as the checks are for all the bounce back loans that have happened with COVID, what's worse is the people who were working on them were taken off the big corporation tax evasion checking teams. They were actually moved across. So everyone who's a big corporate is now sitting there thinking, right now, you know what? I've got a free pass for 2 months, 2 years. And they went, no, it takes too long to train people up. We just got to move them sideways. This, working in HMRC, working in NCA, working in Companies House should be prestigious careers. Elliot Ness, think Elliot Ness taking down the Untouchables and such, right? Tackling crime, something everyone is proud to work on. That's what we need.
Thank you very much, Paul. And on that note, I would say watch this space. I think you've heard this evening about some of the real issues, some quite shocking facts, really, about the current state of play. And thank you very much for your very informed contributions as well from those that have joined this evening. So thank you very much for your time. Do watch this space. There's a lot to campaign for as cooperators and a lot to do this summer over that second bill. And a final thank you to our fantastic speakers, Seema, who has had to leave us, and Paul Monaghan as well. So thank you very much and have a lovely evening.